Most recently, I had the privilege to attend some training that Matt Stamford organised and Kerry Apps organised from through the school's history project, where they invited historians to speak about the latest research on the First Empire in North America. And I then engaged with some really interesting books. I'd read Gaskell's book, actually, but I hadn't read Susan Dwyer Amerson's book, Caribbean Exchanges. I really recommend that, nor Karen Kupperman's book on the myth of Pocahontas. They're all fantastic reads, and I really recommend them. So I started kind of deepening my understanding of Britain's first colonies in North America and the Caribbean through engaging with these historians in that taught session, that CPD session, and then digging into the history. Anyway, the first book I read afterwards was Gaskell's, and then I went on to Amerson's book, and I sat in this very place and read it, and was amazed when I opened the book and began to read the introduction. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to read you the first two paragraphs of Susan Amerson's book, Caribbean Exchanges, because I expected it to begin, well, maybe in London, maybe in North America, maybe, well, I kind of anticipate in the Caribbean, but no. Where did she begin her book? In the village just over the hill behind me here, in the village of East Coker, the next village to me in Somerset. And Amerson wrote, in May 1692, the parish clerk of East Coker, Somerset, recorded the baptism of Thomas William Hellier, Esquire, Blackamoor. The clerk was apparently so startled by this unusual event that he inserted a note above the record, reinforcing Thomas's identity, a black of William Hellier, Esquire. 2 years earlier, John Hellier, that's William's brother, had promised to send his brother William 2 young Negro children by the next ship to serve as household servants or slaves. John was in Jamaica at their father's plantation, Bybrook, some 50 miles north of Spanish Town. William was in East Coker, about 35 miles south of Bristol, where their father was the squire. The Helliers did not baptize slaves in Jamaica, but like other families, they baptized slaves in England. We don't know whether John only sent Thomas, whether another child was sent but died before being baptized, or if the second child made it to England, but for some reason was not baptized. Whether alone or with another child from the plantation, Thomas's journey from Bybrook home to about 110 slaves and less than a dozen white servants to his new home, a pretty Somerset village of some 500 inhabitants, covered more than 4,500 miles. The cultural distance is immeasurable. The village was dominated by Coker Court here, the home of the Helliers. It's now upper end apartments. Yeah, it's on the hill just above the church where Thomas was baptized, Amerson tells us. Thomas was probably the only person of African ancestry in this parish. We don't know what news reached Bybrook about Thomas after his arrival in England. He disappears from the record after his baptism. 9 years later, however, Dr. John Hall, then overseer of Bybrook, ended a letter to the same William Hellier with a short note stating that Betty, a Negro, asks if her son is living with you and sends her love. That, to me, is so incredibly moving. Imagine, that mother having to send one or more, maybe, of her sons to England, and writing through the overseer of the plantation 9 years later not knowing whether her young son was alive or dead, and sending her love in case he was alive. That's so incredibly poignant and moving, it seems to me. Um, and it meant even more to me because this is a village just over the hill. And before I read Emerson's book, I had no idea that the Helliers were slave traders and plantation owners. The history of empire is on our doorsteps, even in rural Somerset. And it certainly is if you teach in London, isn't it? I just some before last, I remember visiting one of my trainee teachers, and I was early, and I walked from the school because I wanted to see the new Spurs ground, even just look at it from the outside. So I had a wander from the school to the Spurs ground and back again. Nearly every street in this network of late 19th century streets around the school where the students lived was named after a battle or a British imperialist. And I wonder whether that was in the curriculum. No, so did children know who these people were, who their streets were named after? I think if we look hard enough, we can usually find lots of local connections with empire. But it came as quite a surprise to find it so close and for it to be so poignant. There's an amazing collection of letters, by the way, which I'm going to research and share with local schools here in the Somerset Archive throughout the 17th and early 18th century, from the plantation overseers and between brothers, the Helliers, one in Somerset, one in Jamaica. So yeah, maybe that's a good starting point then, thinking about the history that's on your doorstep. But in terms of the wider reading I did, it really made me think at a deeper level than I had when I first wrote the Roanoke Enquiry about, what's important to bring out here. And I think these things are things importantly to bring out in planning an enquiry on the early empire. And the focus could be anywhere, couldn't it? I mean, I was thinking you may want to develop an enquiry along these lines that in a way covers a lot of ground, but nothing perhaps in depth. I mean, that's why I put the Hellier plantation at the end here. A case study of the Caribbean linked to a local context. I mean, you could do something like that, couldn't you? Or, the Hellier plantation could be the starting point, and you could teach all of this rich history through that, perhaps. But if you're going for something that's quite, in a way, overviewy like this, you would need to think about the depth and those particular people, particular places, and how you can generate that interest in the particular that's so important in history in any of those contexts. But I think the exploration of the East is fascinating. It's often overlooked, but Ralph Fitch's amazing journey to India and the Far East in the 1580s. Before 20 years or 15 years before the East India Company, anyway, this kind of first expedition, and the encounters that he and his colleagues have with the Portuguese. They're imprisoned, in Goa, and then he treks on alone north, and then travels alone for 4.5 years and returns alive to England, having explored this Eastern territory and noted some marvelous things. It's fascinating history to share with students, I think. Okay, so that's my second object, really, those John White images. Just keeping a check on that. Oh, blimey, the time is going ahead. I'll speed up so that we finish by 8 o'clock, and then we can take some questions. This is the third of my images, and it may be one that's familiar to you. It's one that was recommended to me by Richard Waugh, who was head of children and younger audiences at the British Museum, and Richard asked me to develop some work for their website, Teaching History with 100 Objects, that I'm sure a lot of you use. And I put together some materials around using the Akan drum as a starting point for the transatlantic slave trade. And later, actually, with a really useful suggestion of my colleague Robin Whitburn, originally it was what would the Akan drum, or what did the Akan drum see? Changing it to say made a lot more sense, because of this in Asante culture, some of you know these drums were for communication. But taking a drum, an artifact, and using this as the medium through which students can demonstrate their knowledge and understanding, allowed us to address some really quite sensitive and difficult issues, but created sufficient distance, I think, from this history. So the drum is, I think, is a really useful starting point, a really useful vehicle. Um, Students writing in role as the drum. And I think it's incredibly helpful that, there's this amazingly positive start. This is moving away from the kind of victimhood focus here to one that's much more positive. The place of the drum in Asante culture. There's great materials that you can use with this, because Casely Hayford did a great series on African history and focused on the Asante in one of the programs. So it's all on YouTube you can use. Okay, and it allows us to pick up the legacy. Here's the drum, originally thought to be a North American drum, then identified in the early 20th century as a West African drum, and still in the British Museum. So what does the drum have to say about its legacy? Moving on, I think there's many people I think have moved on and done some really good thinking about their teaching of the transatlantic slave trade in response to Kay's research. This I think is a very useful starting point for principles developed through the HA Fellowship on Transatlantic Slavery, and you can find a lot of really good materials on the HA website following on from the fellowship. But these are some of the things we shouldn't ignore, I think, in teaching about the transatlantic slave trade, and some fantastic research to base this on. Some of it going back. I mean, Jim Walvin's book's quite dated now, from 1993, but still, I think really this was the first book that really enlightened my thinking and developed my thinking in teaching about Britain's long history of slavery. More recently, Toby Green and Patrick Scanlon, who Sam tells me is speaking on the BeBold network on the 4th of May. So that's something really to look forward to.